The big players in the booming Queensland coal seam gas business have been busily signing up customers for some time now, but potentially the biggest of all, Origin Energy's joint venture APLNG project, seemed to be lagging behind. But the agreement by China's Sinopec to buy a 15% stake in the project, plus $90 billion worth of gas over 20 years, means the project is a goer, with at least one processing plant, or train as they're known. Origin's project could end up accounting for almost half the $70 billion worth of projects to be built around the port of Gladstone over the next decade. I spoke to Origin Energy Chief Grant King about his plans. Well, Grant King, now that you've done a binding deal with Sinopec to sell 4.3 million tonnes a year, are you able now to move to final investment decision based just on that and one train?
Well, certainly it greatly enhances the probability we'll make that final investment decision. Just to be clear, that binding agreement has two conditions precedent, that is Chinese and Australian government approvals, but we would expect them to be forthcoming. The other thing we need to do to make that final investment decision is finalise our negotiations with our principal contractors that will deliver the project. So one never presumes all of those things will occur in a particular time frame, but we're clearly expecting that to happen, and we've indicated that sometime around the middle of the year that would be the case. But we're not totally in control of that timetable, particularly when it comes to government approvals.
So are you saying that you expect at this point to make a final investment decision in mid-year?
That's quite likely. We'll make it when we make it. And in respect of the prior question you asked, it's our intention to build a two-train project. We have the resource base to do that. We've clearly now got a one-train sales agreement, and we are, as we said, in respect to that first train now, in respect to the second train, engaged with customers whose requirements can trigger that second train.
What's the total CapEx spend between FID and first gas?
Again, that figure will be released at final investment decision, and that, of course, will be largely informed by the final negotiations with our principal contractors. So we've made no specific announcement on that at this stage.
Is it likely to be 20 billion?
It'll be that order of magnitude. These are very large projects. Clearly, the two other projects in Gladstone have taken FID are of that order of magnitude. So you'd expect the number to be that order of magnitude. So these are big projects.
And can you fund your share of that?
We can fund our share of that. I think the question that interests people is, will we need to do a substantial equity raising in order to fund our share? And the quick answer to that comment is that from a liquidity point of view, we've got plenty of funds available to Origin, particularly with recent syndication of debt facilities. Once we know how much buyer equity is involved, how much project finance comes into the project, we'll know the residual funding task for Origin, and we'll clearly then look at the various sources of funds. We've got debt capital markets, we've talked about hybrids and use of our DRP to provide equity through the construction period. At the end of the day, there may be a requirement to raise some equity, but it probably won't be immediate.
You must have a bit of an idea in your mind now how it's going to look. I mean, you sit there presumably doing the numbers on a blotter, and you must get a sense of what you're going to have to do.
Look, we do have a sense, but going back to an earlier question, these are very large capital projects. Numbers can easily move around $1 billion quite easily as you finalise those estimates. Say today that we'll have a need for X, or $1 billion, or 1 or 2 or none. Those numbers will still move around over the next couple of months as we go to FID. So by far the better time to ask those questions again when we make that announcement.
When do you expect to sign new customers?
Well, again, as we said quite continuously when asked that question in respect to first train marketing, that we are engaged with customers who can trigger that first train. Obviously that was the case, as is evidenced by Sinopec, and that's the case in respect to the second train. But again, it's dangerous to forecast a day or a date in which you'll execute those agreements.
What, is it this year? Do you think you'll be able to sign them this year?
We're very comfortable with the discussions we're having with potential buyers, and we're very comfortable with the conditions in the LNG market, which clearly are more robust than they might have been thought to have been just
because the other problem is actually finding enough people to build it, and the resources, not only given the fact that there's a few of these projects being built in Queensland, but also just so much going on in Australia. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I think there's probably two key comments to make. Each of the projects in Gladstone, for example, will have put in place those strategies they think will allow them to deliver their projects on schedule, on budget, and they would hope, as we would have hoped, to have allowed enough in our schedules and budgets for that to occur, independent of each other, but knowledgeable that all of that activity is occurring at the same time. Now, we believe that to be the case in respect of APLNG, that we can deliver the project on the schedule and at the budget that we'll ultimately commit to at FID. And we believe we've got strategies in place to do that. I think the other challenge is that there is a substantial amount of the workforce on the East Coast that goes to the West Coast, for example, to pursue these projects. So I think, relatively speaking, they may be more inclined to stay on the East Coast, and some of the challenge may well therefore pop up, relatively speaking, on the West Coast simply because you do tend to have that movement from people from east to west to work on those current projects.
Now, the climate change debate in Australia has become very polarised now that the government has announced that it's going to bring in a carbon tax on July the 1st next year. Now, you have been a proponent of carbon tax or carbon pricing for a long time. Origins are potentially a big winner from it through all the gas generation that you have in place. But now that you're a big LNG exporter, is your attitude towards that changing now that you're moving into more of a resource exporter?
To the extent that we seek as a country to reduce carbon emissions, and that's a commitment all sides of politics have made, then we've continuously advocated for a price on carbon to do that. And we've continuously said the best way to do that is through an ETS, not a tax. Now, governments are proposing a period of fixed price. That's a detail that's different from the CPRS. But we continue to advocate a price, but in the form of an ETS, and that's to which we will move given this intervening fixed price period. The second key thing that we've argued is that when governments introduce these major changes, they do need to recognise transitional arrangements are necessary. And quite clearly the two sectors that are most challenged in this area are the generation sector, in the electricity sector at large, coal-fired generators, and the so-called ET sector, the trade-exposed the energy-intensive trade-exposed sector. Now, the challenge, I think, in the debate is for the government to make those appropriate transitional arrangements, and the arguments for those transitional arrangements to apply in the LNG industry is just as strong as they are to apply in the steel industry or other industries.
Do you, in fact, think that resource exporters should be excluded?
Well, we can make two comments, and I think the first and important one is that the goal that Australia set itself is to contribute to a reduction in carbon emissions, and LNG is one of the few industries specifically for which, if we do more of it, we will reduce global carbon emissions. So there's a very good argument for saying Australia should turn up the dial on LNG exports and participate more in an industry which will result in a net reduction of carbon globally. Now, whether that's done by way of imposing a price and then having transitional arrangements or not imposing a price, you get to the same outcome. So governments can choose, in my view, which
you don't mind which?
Because you'd get to the same outcome if you had appropriate transitional arrangements. Other resource sectors will have their own arguments and their own views. It's not universally true that all resources would result in lower carbon emissions, but it's certainly true in respect of the LNG sector that sector in Australia should be supported and expanded because it will, as is intended under a carbon scheme, to reduce global carbon emissions.
So what do you think of the fact that the government in this case has said that the households will get more than 50% of the compensation, and secondly, that it will have to be revenue neutral?
So look, this is why it's a complex negotiation, because there's a fixed pie of revenue and the government is trying to determine how broad that revenue is, and that's in fact or determined by how broad the scheme applies. Does it apply to many sectors or just one sector? So how big will the revenue pool be? And then how much of that revenue pool is, as you say, distributed to households, to generation sector.
But the question is, do the two commitments that I've just mentioned mean that there's going to be less available to compensate emission-intensive trade-exposed industries, as well as the electricity sector?
So I think the answer to that lies in the ability of sectors upon which a carbon price is put to recover that in pricing. So the electricity sector, for example, would expect largely to recover that from consumers. So that sort of revenue neutrality and the way that revenue raised is shared is also partly informed by the ability of each sector to recover in its pricing that revenue as well. Now, having said that, it is right to say that most industries would understand that the way the government is proposing to distribute that revenue will mean there's a challenge in that ET sector in particular to come up with appropriate compensation arrangements. And that's why it's a challenging negotiation for both industry and the government to find a way forward.
We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us, Grant King.
Thanks, Alan.